Hey guys, how are you today? So today we're going to be wrapping up Chapter 7, Section 1. So remember, so far in this section, we've been talking about imperialism, which is not a new concept in history. It's the idea that one country or one group takes over another group, and that's been going on since really time has begun. But we're focusing on new imperialism, this race for colonies, this desperate need to acquire land. And it was really spurred on because of economic reasons, because all these European countries had gone through the Second Industrial Revolution and they were making more products than ever before. And now they need more buyers. They need new markets to sell these products to. Plus, they want to save money. And so they're looking for ways to get the natural resources that they need for cheap, especially if they're an island like Great Britain, right? They only have so much actual land that they control. Plus, the thought process was, remember, in terms of politics, the more land you have, meaning you're more prestigious, you're powerful, you're scary, you're intimidating. And so as they went through all these economic changes, it really inspired them to change their military strategy, to build up their armies, to build up their navies, and in turn to use those armies and navies and new technological weapons like the Maxim machine gun to go ahead and take over people who could not fight back because they didn't have immunity to diseases or because they didn't have the weaponry in Africa and Asia. And they really believed that they were justified in doing so because, especially the British, they believed in something called Anglo-Saxonism, that they were superior in every way. Some people told themselves that what they were doing was the Christian thing to do, that it was humanitarian. And there were some good Christian missionaries out there and doctors who went about the world and wanted to meet new peoples, to spread Christianity and to give them medical, help and supplies. But there were many people who just used Christianity as an excuse or believed they were superior because of Anglo-Saxonism and they should spread their language and culture. There were people who justified it because of social Darwinism, saying that if you die, well, that's science, that's evolution. You were just meant to. And there were others who actually, yet again, convinced themselves that they were helping the people that they conquered, that it was their duty, their burden, as Rudyard Kipling talked about in that poem, to go ahead and to help the less fortunate, who they classified as half savage beasts, half devils, because they lacked Christianity and technology. And so they start to take over these people in Africa and Asia. And remember, we talked about how they might rule over them directly and create a colony like the French did in Vietnam, or they might rule over them more indirectly, where they leave local rulers in place like the British did with the people of India, and they created a protectorate. Some were just interested in gaining exclusive trade rights, a sphere of influence. So what we're going to move on today is talking about is we're going to start really focusing on American imperialism. We'll talk a little bit more so later about the British and the French and some of the European powers, but we're not going to go into too much depth about that because that's more world history or world history honors or Western Civ if you took that. We'll talk a little bit about it when we come back from Christmas break, when we enter our World War I unit, because it's going to be this scramble for land in Africa to see who can be the most powerful in the world that helped leads us to World War I. And remember, I showed you a map of that the other day about how by the time World War I starts, it's all been conquered except for Ethiopia because they had modernized and they had machine guns to fight back with. But otherwise, everybody gets conquered. And it's that fight over who's the biggest, the baddest, which leads us to the big world conflict. But today we're going to really focus on what the U.S. is doing. So we're going to talk first about Alaska, and then we're going to talk about Hawaii. So if you think back to our unit on westward expansion, we talked about manifest destiny, right? This desire to expand from sea to shining sea, that we believed it was ordained by God that Americans should expand because we have this superior culture and way of life. And of course, it would help us economically. And we claimed we wanted to spread democracy, even though there isn't a whole lot that's democratic about conquering a group of people and forcing them to assimilate, right? But that was our thought process. As we moved westward, we bought up land, right, from other nations, went to war with Mexico if need be, bought the rest of the land from the British and the French, and we expanded from sea to shining sea, and to heck with the Native Americans. At least that was our kind of, racist ideology belief system. And the Native Americans were forced to assimilate, right? They were forced to go to, under the Dawes Act, schools, cut their hair, change their way of life, and if they didn't, well, then they were going to face, death, destruction, control on the reservation system. So now that Americans have already expanded, they're looking for new places to expand. Remember, Frederick Jackson Turner had said in his thesis, in his claim, what will happen to America? Will we fall apart? Will we change our values now that there is no more places to discover? There's no more pioneer spirit. There's no more rugged individualism where we can't always reinvent ourselves and create a new job. What if our cities get too overcrowded? What will happen next? And people were already kind of feeling that and worried about what would happen to the future of America. So we were interested in acquiring more territory. And so naturally, we were interested in acquiring here the territory that is Alaska. And there were multiple reasons for wanting Alaska. For one thing, of course, it is, far from, the continental, the mainland United States. And so the thought process was, we can build a base here. We can build a military base for protection. And if someone would try to come in and attack the United States, we'll be able to keep it safe. The other thought process was, we were starting to realize, hey, wait a minute. England is, of course, the strongest country in the world. It doesn't necessarily have the best army. It's a decent army, but it has the biggest navy. It has more territory around the globe than anyone else. It's definitely a world power to be feared and to be challenged. How are we going to compete against them, especially since, the British here owned Canada and Australia and New Zealand and India, and, they were interested in China, and we were very worried that they were expanding and going to perhaps take over the world. And so what's going to happen is that Russia here, okay, they're going to decide that they had owned Alaska, which made sense logically because they're really not that far from Alaska. They had taken over the Alaskan people years before. The Alaskan people, of course, you've got the Inuit tribe there, the Eskimos. They were never happy about being conquered and colonized by the Russians, but they, of course, were not consulted. And so Russia obviously conquered, the Alaskan people because of close proximity. Russia ends up going through a period of change. When Tsar Alexander II is on the throne, they end up fighting a war called the Crimean War. It's very costly. Lives are lost. Russia's going through kind of a time of change where they're trying to industrialize a bit. It's a very backwards country where it's just still focused on farming for the most part and what we would call serfdom, where you are tied to the land and you have to work for somebody else's land, which is a concept that was like out of the Middle Ages, where you had serfs and farmers and such. Who had to basically work for someone else, almost like the sharecropping system that was, existing in the U.S. And so, it was a time of change, and Alexander II was freeing the serfs and fighting wars, and they were losing, and basically they needed money. That's what it all boiled down to. They realized they were never going to have a huge empire. The British had this stronghold. They controlled Canada. Many of the people in Canada were fighting for their freedom. Some wanted to be part of France. There was drama there. And they realized, we need money, and we're never going to be able to fight against the British and conquer all of Canada, so we might as well just sell Alaska. Let's just sell Alaska, let's get the money, and they could use that to rebuild St. Petersburg, which was one of their new big great cities, right, that had been created after Peter the Great. So they actually sell it to Secretary of State here, William Seward, for only $7.2 million. And they had been talking about selling it to the U.S. for actually quite a few years, like from the 1850s on. But the U.S. was embroiled with the Civil War from 1860 to 1865, so this didn't actually happen until 1867. William Seward, he was the Secretary of State, which means you're in charge of foreign affairs. He was the one who brokered the deal. A lot of people thought it was an idiotic purchase. They actually called it Seward's folly, and like a folly is like a joke. And they're like, yeah, Seward, you're such a joke. This is such a stupid purchase. Why did you spend $7.2 million, which is, quite a fair amount of money back then? Why did you do it for this big hunk of ice out in the middle of nowhere? Like, who the heck's ever going to leave the United States to go vacation there? True, not a great vacation spot. Considered just to be amount of, so much full of ice and snow. Why would people want to go there? The only kind of real reasoning at the time why Seward said we needed it was he said, look, we want to stop the British from expanding. We don't want the British, who are also controlling Canada, and the Canadians are fighting for their freedom, and the French own part of Canada, and there's all this drama going on there. He's like, you don't want them to make an even bigger empire and take over even more land. Plus, we need a base that's not actually part of mainland U.S. to protect us in case there is some kind of world conflict. And he was right. It is going to become very valuable as we're fighting World War II, because we're going to use it as a launching off base so that we can leave Alaska and then we can go down and fight, against Japan and things like that as we have battles in the Pacific. So it is going to play an important role later. But for the most part, people thought he was very stupid. And they kind of questioned Seward's judgment. Many other people respected Seward. He was a survivor. He was one of the ones that, was part of the Lincoln assassination plot. Remember when Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth? They were supposed to take out his conspirators, the whole government. And Lincoln, remember, was killed at Ford's Theater. President Johnson, or Vice President Johnson at the time, he was never attacked. That conspirator chickened out. But remember, Seward was stabbed multiple times, and then he did survive that assassination attempt. So other people respected him and said, no, he knows what he's doing. He's a great guy. He's done service to our country. He's got a plan. Let's just trust him. But some people really wasn't sure, and his plan really didn't pay off for years to come. It wasn't until 1896 that gold was discovered, and that was the Klondike Gold Rush, which we talked about in our westward expansion unit. And of course, that led to mining and the creation of cities and more people migrating there. And then, of course, as I said, it becomes really more successful and kind of plays a role in our history more so in World War II as a base as we're fighting against Japan. And then eventually it becomes a state in 1959, becoming the 49th state. Now let's talk about Alaska. So when it comes to Alaska, that is actually going to be the other portion of territory that we're really interested in early on, kind of towards the end of the Gilded Age, the beginning of this age of imperialism, progressive era. And of course, if you've ever been to Hawaii, it's an amazing place to go. If you've never been there, you should totally go one day. I love Hawaii. I went back in, I think 2008. My best friend got married there. And when people say Hawaii, they always think about it as one place, but it is, of course, an archipelago. It is a series of islands, a chain of islands. And of course, you've got the big island here, which is Hawaii. I personally flew into Oahu. Many people fly into Oahu. And then I went to Maui, which is where my best friend got married. But you've got the big island of Hawaii, which is very active with volcanoes and such. And then there is an island which you've never been to, which is this Niihau. This is an island reserved for just Hawaiian natives, so people who are of Hawaiian descent. You cannot go there otherwise. And the reason being is that, Hawaii is a territory which is conquered. The Alaskan people were not happy about the sale, or I should say the acquisition of Alaska, originally from the Russian people. They were also not happy when America bought it. You had some people who were happy and thought, oh, hooray, America bought us. Maybe they'll let us practice our way of life again. But you had other people who were angry and said, no, the Americans aren't going to be any different than the Russians. Maybe they might even be worse. They're going to tell us what to do. We're not going to be allowed to practice our culture. The Americans, honestly, were not too interfering with the Inuit tribes, with the Eskimos, with the native people's way of life. But still, they were not consulted or respected. But there wasn't like a true resistance movement or fight or war. It's different in Hawaii, though. Hawaii is not going to be a happy story. It's going to be about people who are conquered, who do not want to be conquered, and they are taken forcibly, which is why Hawaii doesn't officially get, even though it gets annexed and the territory gets added, the people do not actually consider themselves to be true Americans, and it does not become a state until the 1950s, and it becomes the 50th state added. And to try to continue to give those people some sense of freedom and respect, they have this separate island which tourists cannot go to, which is just meant for Hawaiians. Now, as far as why we were interested in going to Hawaii, if you take a look at the map here, you can really see why we're interested in going to Hawaii. Yet again, as we're looking at the 1870s, 1880s here, as we're in the Gilded Age, different foreign policy analysts, remember foreign policy is just looking at what's happening in world affairs, they said, we need more territory away from the U.S. mainland that we own, that we can use to protect ourselves if need be. Because if somebody comes to attack California, it's going to be, difficult. So if they would somehow come in, they would attack California, we were going to struggle. We would like to stop an attack before it ever gets to California. In time, once we built, more cars and an interstate highway system, the thought process was, or planes, these are still, only a few rich people. We don't see the first flight even until 1903, and then it's really reserved for the wealthy. Same thing with cars. Only the wealthy own them. We're not going to see more average Americans in terms of wealth getting them until the 1920s, 1915, give or take, and then really the 1920s. So, a lot of our military bases were along Washington, D.C. and along the East Coast. So to get supplies to California, if it was somehow attacked by someone, like the Chinese, the Japanese, just it seemed scary. So the thought process was, what if we had Hawaii? What if we owned these islands? We could somehow have a naval base here and we could stop an attack. One of the premier analysts at this time was a man by the name of Alfred Mahan. And he talked about how important it was to build up our Navy. And we really didn't have a Navy at this time. We had an Army, but we did not have a truly good Navy. It had never been built up. It was just a couple of ships, so to speak. It was nothing impressive by any means. And he said, we need to have a world-class Navy, just like the British do, and now the Germans are building, and the French. We need to show them that we're a world power. And wouldn't it be fantastic if we owned this territory and we had this world Navy and had a naval base there and we could stop an attack on the west coast of the United States? Plus, it puts us kind of in as a player, more so that, if there was a conflict, we are not that far then from Korea, from Japan, from China, from the Philippines, from New Zealand here or Australia. We're in more kind of the Pacific if we acquire these islands, which are nice in the middle. Not to mention the fact that they've got fantastic weather and, they are, could be a vacation spot. And of course, these ships, they of course are using coal, as a fuel source. So they're using coal. Eventually they're going to be moving to using oil and gasoline. But, the thought process was, if we are going to be building this world-class Navy, yet again, they need kind of like a refueling stop, so to speak. And this would really play that part. So some of the first people to go and explore Hawaii, one of them was an explorer by the name of James Cook. And he was sent and commissioned by the Earl of Sandwich. If you've ever been to Disney World, there's like a whole Earl of Sandwich shop where they sell delicious sandwiches at Disney Springs, by the way. But yeah, they're pretty tasty. I don't know, I was just thinking about that. I'm kind of hungry myself. But James Cook is an explorer, and he goes ahead and he explores, these islands of Hawaii because he was commissioned by this Earl of Sandwich. And so for a while, they were actually called the Sandwich Islands. So you might hear some of that. If people ever refer to the Sandwich Islands, there you go. That's what they're talking about. James Cook also did some early exploration into Australia and into some of these other places as he was sent by other people and they gave him money for, exploratory missions. So we've been interested in Hawaii for quite some time because it was a great spot for a military base to protect us. It was a place to refuel ships. It was a great vacation spot. For all of these various reasons. It would put us as a player in terms of world power. It got us, into connection with other countries. And when we had gone there, some of the first people to go there are missionaries, and they're the ones to really start establishing a presence in Hawaii. They create this Imola Church. It was first built in the late 1820s. And the idea was to bring Christianity to these savage people. So these were good Christian people, good missionaries. They had no ulterior motives. They are just trying to spread the good news, so to speak, teach them about religion. Because most of the Hawaiian people, were polytheistic more, or believed in multiple gods, or some of them believed more in spirits. Some of them, just we're talking about very different polytheistic more beliefs than monotheistic. So ultimately, we had some people who wanted to go to Hawaii for these good motive reasons, but there were many people who, of course, want to go to Hawaii and are going to think that it's okay to take over the Hawaiian people because of social Darwinism, right? If they can't fight back, that's their own fault. That's evolution, that's science. There's other people who think that it's okay to take over the Hawaiian people because maybe they'll spread democracy there, which is a joke, or they think they're a superior group in terms of race. There's a lot of other justifications going on here. Now, the big reason that Americans really get interested in Hawaii, it's not just political, military reasons. It's just not about humanitarianism or justifying our actions because of a white man's burden or social Darwinism. The big other motivation here is economics. And of course, Hawaii has an amazing climate. We're talking about warm, and sugar can grow there really well. Sugarcane. And of course, pineapples and just different vegetation that doesn't grow well in the United States. I mean, you guys are familiar with the fact that, of course, people think about, ooh, okay, we're going to get, delicious, Georgia peaches, or we're going to get, avocados from Florida, or we're going to get, avocados from Florida. Avocados more so from California, but we're going to get, oranges from Florida. So there's different foods that, of course, grow better in certain parts of the country, just like, of course, you're living in the Midwest, and so, you're in the middle of this corn belt. So in Hawaii, pineapples grow well, sugar grows well. And so many American businessmen, specifically two men named Stanford B. Dole and James B. Dole, they decide to buy up some land very cheaply in Hawaii, and they decide to learn how to grow sugar, have this huge sugarcane plantation, hire some of the native peoples, paying them very low wages for their work. And then they also, of course, grow pineapples. I'm sure you know that because you've heard of Dole fruit and Dole pineapples and things like that. And they become very wealthy. And for a while, things are well. Now, the Hawaiian government is a monarchy, right? So you've got a king on the throne, and if he dies, it becomes his son, and if he doesn't have his son, his daughter. And they've been in power for years and years. And all seems well, at least for a while. And we know that in 1875, there is basically a treaty that is formed that allows the sale of Hawaiian sugar in the U.S. without basically a tariff, okay? Meaning that, usually when you have goods which are coming in from a foreign country, like if we're buying stuff from China or from Britain or from France, when it comes into the United States, there has to be some kind of tax paid, because you're buying a foreign good. And so it's a tax on what we call imports. So for the most part, usually those types of goods are being taxed. Well, in 1875, a treaty was created which said, you know what, we're not going to tax these goods which come from Hawaii, which meant that was good for the Dole brothers, because if they had to pay a tax to the U.S. government because they were bringing sugar, which they grew in Hawaii, which was a foreign country, back to the U.S. for sale so that Americans could have pineapples and sugar and sugarcane, if they had to pay the tax, you knew what was going to happen. They would start charging the American people a higher price so that they wouldn't lose out on any profits. Well, they don't want to pay a tax, and they don't want to raise their prices because that means people would buy less goods. So they worked out this deal with the U.S. government. They were very wealthy, and as you can imagine, remember this is the Gilded Age here in 1875, they would use their money to influence politicians to basically not tax, goods from Hawaii and to work out this treaty. Now, as the Gilded Age is coming to an end, we see that President McKinley is going to be coming in office. The last real true Gilded Age president is going to be President Cleveland, and then it's going to be President McKinley, who's kind of the very end of our Gilded Age, the first of our progressive era imperialism presidents. Well, before McKinley became a president, he served in Congress, and he is a big supporter of a tariff. A tariff means tax, and he's a big supporter of a tax on imported goods because he says we need to raise more money. We need to either start an income tax where we're taxing the American people and everybody pays taxes, or we need to tax goods. And this is before the 16th Amendment was passed, right? That creates a national income tax where your parents pay taxes in April, and you will one day as well. Before the income tax, though, you had to pay taxes on goods to raise money so the U.S. government can have an army, have a navy, right? Rebuild roads, things of that nature. So McKinley, when he was in Congress, he said we need to have a higher tax on imported goods so that we have more money for revenue, basically for rebuilding America, making it a better place, industrialization, army, navy, etc. And even though Cleveland, was the president, he wasn't a huge supporter of this idea. He was a Democrat. McKinley was a Republican. They had different political views. But Congress passes it, and this McKinley tariff is expensive. And so what happens now is that the Dole brothers, they're going to basically say to themselves, crap, we are going to have to raise prices on our goods because we still want to make a profit, and we're greedy robber barons, basically. And we have to pay this tax now to the American government because of the McKinley tariff. So we're going to, we have to pay the tax. So basically we're going to pass that on to our customers by raising prices. Well, as you can imagine, when they raised the prices, people stopped buying as much. They're not making as much money. They didn't like this. And so they start to basically say to themselves, what if we make Hawaii part of the U.S.? What if we overthrow King Caligula, and what if we basically create a new U.S. territory. Okay, a new territory has been added before, just like Texas was once it was a separate country. First it was part of Mexico, and then it was its own country, and then it became a U.S. territory, and then a U.S. state. What if we do the same thing here in Hawaii? And so many of the wealthy men who basically had their own private military contractors, and they had support back in Washington, they basically overthrow the government, and they take out King Caligula. They force him basically at bayonet point. Bayonets, that's the sharp end at your end of your weapon here, attached to your gun. They force him to basically accept that he is no longer the king, that the monarchy is over, and that they are in charge of the government and the bayonet constitution. And so white planters are now in charge. And under this new government that they create, it's going to be that the Dole brothers are going to be electing themselves basically as the new leaders of this new Hawaiian separate republic, because only whites will be allowed to vote. Whites made up a very small percentage of the Hawaiian population, but they're not going to give Hawaiian people any rights. Let them vote. They're going to take control of the government. They're going to, of course, apply to get annexed to become part of the U.S., because if they're part of the U.S., they figure then they won't have to pay that tax. It's all about the money. And of course, as we said, many American businessmen back in the U.S. government, they could be bribed. They liked the robber barons. There was a lot of graft going on, and they wanted to get Hawaii anyway as a vacation spot, a military and naval base. And so what you can see in the cartoon here at the bottom is that King Caligula is going to basically be forced to sign this because, these Dole brothers are telling him what to do, and you can see how these are bayonets kind of pointing up towards the chair, and Caligula will be out, and next in line for the throne will be his daughter, Queen Liliuokalani, which is why she's kind of in that picture on the throne. And so here is some other pictures here of Queen Liliuokalani, and she is basically told that she has to accept this bayonet constitution, otherwise she's going to face death for herself, for the Hawaiian people. We're talking about mass destruction. And, as I said, these Dole brothers had basically their own private armies, and they had support from Washington, and it was just a mess. They even brought in some U.S. Army, some, troops. And this was pretty much all without the president's really consent. It all had really happened through the help of some congressmen who were friends with the Dole brothers. And Liliuokalani at first thought maybe she would accept it, because she basically, just like her father, faced potentially death if she didn't do this, and she didn't want to see her people die. And so for a very short term, she kind of accepts things. But then she basically says, forget it. I'm not going to accept this. I refuse to accept this. I want to regain Hawaii for Hawaiian people. We're the majority of the population. We shouldn't be told by these wealthy, rich white men what to do, and we don't want to become part of the United States. So she vows to get rid of this bayonet constitution. She says Hawaii should be for Hawaiian people. Now, in 1893, is when the Dole brothers had, led this uprising against King Caligula and, basically forced him to sign the bayonet constitution. And then, they kind of started creating this new government where Stanford B. Dole was elected president of the Republic of Hawaii, and they're talking about annexing it. And as I said, all this kind of went down without President Cleveland's support. It was all through kind of private military contracts, people that were friends, with politicians and with the Dole brothers who saw the advantages of gaining Hawaii for the U.S. And eventually, Queen Liliuokalani, she does try to launch this uprising to end the bayonet constitution, but they overthrow her. And yet again, her uprising was kind of small. We're still talking about people who, even though they know the land and they have the homeland advantage, they didn't have the technology that the Americans had. And so she is overthrown. And just like her father, she is forced to accept the bayonet constitution, the fact that Stanford B. Dole there is now the president of the Republic of Hawaii. And then it starts this annexation debate. So this is kind of, they claim that they're a free country. First they were Hawaiian. Now they claim that they're a free country, not led by the Hawaiian people. They're no longer a monarchy. They're basically a democracy, and he was elected leader. But they're not truly a U.S. territory yet. And so there was this debate about whether they should be annexed, and President Cleveland refused. He was mad because he was not consulted, because he felt like these congressmen and women, I should just say men, there were no women yet, went behind his back to gain private military forces to force this to happen, because Hawaiian people were killed in the process, people were assaulted, their rights were not taken into respect, and he was an anti-imperialist. He said, no, this is wrong. This is not about democracy, this is not about humanitarian reasons, this is about wealth and power and greed. And he was an anti-imperialist, and he said, no, I refuse to annex Hawaii. But when Cleveland is done with his second term, remember he's the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive, meaning 2 non-back-to-back terms. When President McKinley comes into office, he quickly signs and makes the U.S., Hawaii is now a U.S. territory. It has been annexed. It's not officially a state, but it's been annexed because he's an imperialist president. He's all about expanding our property. He had gotten elected with the help of all the robber barons who gave him, financial contributions to his campaign. And they want to see the U.S. gain more land because that means potentially more resources. Now, Hawaii, as I said, the Hawaiian people were very angry about this. They were very bitter about this, which is why, for a long time there was this idea that there should just be, an island that is just for the Hawaiian people, Niihau, that, Americans cannot go to. Oh, gosh, I screwed that up twice. Sorry. Oh, my gosh. I'm just going to leave it like that. And yeah, Hawaii, of course, there's a lot of bitterness and a lot of resentment. It just stays a U.S. territory, but the people are not officially citizens for a long time. It doesn't become a state until 1959, becoming the 50th state in the Union. We, of course, saw its value, in World War II. Yes, obviously it was attacked December 7th, 1941, which is just coming up here in a few days. It'll be the anniversary, the attack on Pearl Harbor. So yes, it was attacked. It's what led to our involvement officially in World War II, our declaration of war just a few days later by President Roosevelt. But it also was valuable because we were able to use that base to stop future attacks on the western coast. And eventually, when President Clinton was in office in 1993, he did officially sign a formal apology to the Hawaiian people for the way we acted, the way we ruined their land, stole their resources, treated them. So that's kind of the story of how Hawaii, and it became part of the U.S., and it was not such an easy tale, and it was definitely some criminal acts on the part of Americans. All right, guys, have a great day.